What happens when a man hijacks Steve Harvey's stage with a surprise proposal? The crowd gasped. Steve's reaction left everyone in stitches, and what happened next became one of the most unforgettable moments in TV history. You won't believe how this story ends. T was just another exciting day on the set of The Steve Harvey Show. The audience was buzzing with energy, the cameras were rolling, and Steve himself was in top form. As always, he carried that signature mix of charm, humor, and wisdom that made millions of people love him. He knew how to make an audience laugh until their sides hurt, and just as quickly, he could turn serious and inspire them with one of his famous motivational speeches. That day seemed no different, at least at first. People in the crowd were laughing, clapping, and enjoying every second. But hidden among the smiling faces in the very first row was someone who wasn't just there to be entertained. He had something on his mind, something that would soon change the atmosphere of the entire studio. This young man was dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, his tie neatly knotted, his shoes polished until they shined under the bright stage lights. But if you looked closely, you could see that he wasn't at ease. His fingers tapped nervously against his leg, his foot bounced on the floor, and his eyes kept darting around the room as though he were waiting for the right moment. Inside his pocket, he clutched a small velvet box so tightly that his knuckles turned white. To the audience, he might have looked like just another guest. But to him, this was the biggest day of his life. He wasn't just attending a show, he was preparing for a life-changing moment. Meanwhile, Steve was doing what he did best, working the crowd. He moved across the stage, telling stories, cracking jokes, and making quick, playful comments about audience members. Laughter filled the studio, and the cameras caught every smile, every reaction, every burst of applause. But then, something unusual happened. As Steve's eyes swept across the front row, he noticed the young man in the suit. Steve's instincts, sharpened from years of reading people, told him something wasn't quite right. This wasn't just a case of nerves. The man wasn't laughing like everyone else. He wasn't clapping on cue. Instead, he looked like someone carrying a secret. Steve stopped mid-sentence. He tilted his head, narrowed his eyes just slightly, and then cracked a sly grin. Pointing toward the young man, Steve said in his deep, commanding voice, "Son, you look like you got something on your mind." The studio audience instantly shifted their attention. Heads turned. Cameras zoomed in. The room that had been roaring with laughter just moments before now fell into curious silence. The young man froze for a second, as though all the air had been sucked from his lungs. He hadn't expected Steve to call him out so directly. His palms grew sweaty, his throat tightened, but deep down he knew this was his chance. Slowly, he rose from his seat. His hands trembled, and his voice caught in his throat as the spotlight seemed to find him. The entire studio, Steve, the cameras, the producers, the live audience, were all locked in on him. For a moment, he looked like he might back down, like the weight of the moment was too much. But then, almost as if reminding himself why he was there, he reached into his pocket and tightened his grip on the velvet box. The air in the room grew heavy with anticipation. Steve leaned back slightly, studying the man with curiosity, while the audience leaned forward, whispering and waiting to see what would happen next. And then, with a shaky breath, the man cleared his throat and took his first step toward the stage. Every eye in the room followed him. Every camera swiveled in his direction. His heart pounded so loudly he thought the entire studio could hear it. Nobody in that audience knew what was coming. Not Steve, not the producers, not even the woman sitting a few rows back who was about to become the center of his world. But what everyone did know, deep down, was that something unforgettable was about to happen. The young man's voice cracked slightly as he asked if he could step onto the stage. Steve Harvey, never one to turn down a moment of curiosity, raised his eyebrows with a playful grin. "All right, come on up here. Let's see what you got," Steve said, his voice carrying that perfect blend of humor and suspicion. The crowd laughed, assuming this was about to be another funny audience moment, maybe a story, maybe a joke, or maybe even a talent performance. Nobody could have predicted what was about to happen. As the man walked up the steps, the audience clapped politely, their faces filled with curiosity. He looked nervous, his movements stiff, but there was also a quiet determination in his eyes. Steve stepped aside to give him space, folding his arms across his chest as if waiting for a punchline. But instead of cracking a joke or telling a story, the man reached deep into his suit pocket. Slowly, he pulled out a small velvet box. The studio gasped as he dropped to one knee right in the middle of Steve Harvey's stage. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the cameras seemed to freeze, zooming in tightly on the dramatic scene. From the audience, a young woman suddenly stood up. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide in shock, tears instantly pooling at the edges. She was the reason behind it all. The man's secret, the nervous fidgeting, the shaking hands, it all made sense now. This moment had been carefully planned, but for her, it was a complete surprise. The man's voice trembled as he spoke, his words echoing through the hushed studio. I wanted the whole world to know how much I love you. And there's no better place than right here, on Steve Harvey's stage. Will you marry me? For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stand still, and then the audience erupted. The silence shattered into thunderous applause, cheers, and whistles. Some people jumped from their seats, clapping wildly. Others wiped away tears, overcome by the sudden wave of emotion. The woman, shaking, made her way toward the stage. Every step she took felt heavy with emotion, her eyes locked on the man kneeling before her. By now, tears were streaming down her face, her hands trembling as she covered her mouth in disbelief. The man held the ring out to her, his eyes shining with hope and fear all at once. He had just put his heart on the line, not just for her, but for the entire world to see. But before she could even open her mouth to answer, Steve Harvey stepped in, with his classic timing. Steve raised his hand, walked toward the couple, and said in his booming, half-joking voice, Hold up, hold up, hold up. Y'all ain't just gonna hijack my whole show like this. The crowd roared with laughter. The sudden switch from heartfelt tension to Steve's trademark comedy was pure magic. The man on his knee let out a nervous chuckle, while the woman wiped her tears and laughed through her shock. Steve wasn't done. He circled around them, his eyebrows raised, his mustache twitching in amusement. You mean to tell me you came all dressed up, got a ring, and decided this was the moment? Right here? On my stage? The audience howled, clapping and cheering louder. Steve pointed at the young man and added, Boy, you better hope she says yes, 'cause if she don't, I ain't got enough jokes to save you. The young woman's tears turned into laughter as she shook her head in disbelief. The man smiled nervously, still holding the ring. The audience, caught between laughter and suspense, leaned forward, waiting for the woman's response. But Steve wasn't done grilling the poor guy. He bent down slightly, microphone in hand, and asked, Before we let her answer, I need to know, you got a job? You got a car? You got somewhere for this girl to live? Don't be dragging her into no trouble if you ain't ready, son. The man quickly nodded, his voice firm now. Yes, sir. I've been saving up for this. I'm ready. Steve looked at him, then looked at the young woman, then back at the crowd. Finally, he stepped aside dramatically, waving his hand toward the woman. All right, baby girl, it's on you now. But let me warn you. If you say no, I'm just telling you right now, this man gon' need therapy. And I don't cover them bills. The studio shook with laughter, but behind it all, the tension remained. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every second. The young woman's tears sparkled under the bright lights as she prepared to give her answer. The proposal was no longer just a private moment between two people. It was now a moment for everyone, a live audience, millions of viewers, and of course Steve Harvey himself. And yet, despite the comedy, the noise, and the cameras, it all came down to one question. Would she say yes? Now, if you know Steve Harvey, you know he doesn't just stand quietly in moments like this. The man had barely gotten down on one knee before Steve was already leaning forward, his eyebrows raised, mustache twitching, and that mischievous smile spreading across his face. Hold up. Y'all really just gonna hijack my show like this? Steve boomed into the mic. The audience exploded with laughter. They weren't expecting this twist at all, and Steve's reaction only made the moment funnier. He pointed at the man still kneeling with the velvet box, shaking his head like a father scolding his son. You mean to tell me I'm out here working, trying to host a show, and you just go and show up with your little ring box, your shiny shoes, and steal my thunder? The crowd was in stitches. People clapped, slapped their knees, and shouted in amusement. The nervous groom-to-be smiled sheepishly, clearly embarrassed but determined to stay focused. He wasn't about to let Steve's jokes throw him off his mission, but Steve wasn't done. Oh no, he was just warming up. He paced the stage dramatically, microphone in hand, turning the whole situation into a comedy routine. I can't even get through one show without somebody taking over. Next thing you know, somebody gonna show up here wanting to baptize their baby on my stage. This ain't no church, man. The audience roared louder. The tension that had once filled the room was now mixed with joy, laughter, and curiosity. But still, everyone was waiting for the most important answer, the woman's. Finally, Steve turned serious, his playful smile fading into a thoughtful expression. He walked over to the man on his knee, leaned down slightly, and asked in his deep, commanding voice, "Listen, I need to know something before she answers. Son, you got a job? You got a car? You got a place for this woman to live? Don't be dragging her into something if you ain't ready." The audience went silent for a moment. It was classic Steve. Behind the jokes, there was always real wisdom. Everyone knew he was dead serious about this part. Marriage wasn't just about romance. It was about responsibility, stability, and building a future. The young man's nervous smile widened. He straightened his back, his voice steadier than before. "Yes, sir," he said proudly. "I've been saving up for this moment. I'm ready." There was something in his tone that carried conviction. He wasn't just saying it for the cameras, he meant it. He had come prepared not only with a ring, but with a promise that he was ready to step up and take care of the woman he loved. Steve studied him for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the young man as if to see whether the words matched the truth. The pause seemed to last forever. Then finally, Steve nodded slowly, as if giving his seal of approval. The audience clapped, relieved, their excitement growing again. Steve then turned to the young woman, who was still standing in shock, tears sliding down her cheeks. She looked caught between laughter and disbelief, her hand clutching her chest as she stared at the man kneeling before her. Steve raised the mic again, his voice booming. "All right, baby girl, it's your call now. But just know if you say no, this brother gon' need therapy and we ain't paying for it." The audience roared with laughter once more, the tension breaking for just a second. But beneath the comedy, the room was thick with suspense. Every eye in that studio was on the young woman. The cameras zoomed in close, capturing her every blink, every tear, every shaky breath. The young man on his knee held the ring toward her, his heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo in the silence between the laughs. The crowd was torn between laughter and anticipation. Steve had made the moment entertaining, but now it was real again. This was it. The answer was coming. And in that instant, you could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air like electricity. Would she say yes or no? Everyone in the studio leaned forward, breath caught in their throats. It was as if time itself had slowed. The young woman's hands covered her face, shoulders shaking as she tried to process what was happening. The man knelt patiently on the stage, holding out the ring, his eyes locked on her as if she were the only person in the world. Steve Harvey, meanwhile, paced dramatically, fanning himself with his cue cards like he'd just witnessed a soap opera twist. Lord have mercy. This girl about to pass out. Somebody get her some water, he joked, sending another wave of laughter through the crowd. But even Steve knew this was no ordinary TV moment. This was real life unfolding. Finally, the woman reached for the microphone. Her fingers trembled, her breathing uneven. The studio fell into pin-drop silence. You could hear the hum of the cameras, the faint shuffle of feet in the audience, even the nervous gulp from the young man on his knee. With a voice full of emotion, she whispered, I can't believe this is happening." I had no idea. And Steve's right, this is crazy, it's scary, but it's also the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me. Tears rolled down her cheeks as the audience gasped and leaned even closer. And then, in a sudden burst of joy, she looked down at the man she loved and shouted, "Yes! Of course I'll marry you!" The entire studio erupted. The crowd leapt to their feet, clapping and cheering so loudly the sound almost drowned out everything else. Some people screamed, others cried, strangers hugged each other like they had just witnessed history. The energy in that room was electric, like a championship game-winning shot had just been scored. The man jumped to his feet, slipped the ring onto her finger, and pulled her into a tight embrace. She wrapped her arms around him, still crying, still laughing, her joy completely uncontainable. Steve Harvey stood off to the side, hands on his hips, shaking his head with exaggerated disbelief. When the cheers finally began to quiet down, he stepped back into the spotlight with the kind of timing only Steve Harvey could pull off. "All right, hold on, he said, waving his hand like a traffic cop trying to stop rush hour. The couple looked at him, still holding each other. and the audience sat back down, eager to hear what he was about to say. Steve pointed at the groom-to-be, then at the bride-to-be, his voice booming with mock seriousness. Y'all really just gonna get engaged on my stage? Steal my thunder and then expect me to just keep on with the show like nothing happened? No sir, not today. The audience laughed, but Steve wasn't done. He turned to his staff off stage and shouted, Somebody cue the wedding march. Matter of fact, get me a preacher up in here. We gonna marry these two right now! The audience went absolutely wild. People screamed, clapped, and stomped their feet as the famous wedding march began playing over the speakers. The young couple looked stunned, covering their faces with their hands, half laughing, half crying at what was happening. Steve strutted across the stage, pretending to officiate the wedding. He raised his hand dramatically and declared, Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today on national television with zero rehearsal, zero planning, and probably zero legal paperwork, to witness the union of these two lovebirds who just hijacked my show. The laughter shook the studio. People were crying tears of joy. The cameras zoomed in on the couple, who couldn't stop laughing as Steve continued. Do you, young man, promise not to annoy her, not to leave your socks on the floor, and not to play video games when she's talking to you? The man, still grinning from ear to ear, shouted, I do! Steve then turned to the young woman. And do you, young lady, promise not to spend all his money on shoes, not to change the Netflix password without telling him, and not to bring up stuff he did wrong back in 2018? The woman laughed so hard she nearly doubled over, but through the tears she shouted, I do! The audience howled with laughter, clapping and cheering. Steve raised his hands like a pastor delivering the final line. Well, by the power vested in me as a broke talk show host with way too many jobs, I now pronounce y'all almost married. The couple kissed, the crowd screamed, and the cameras captured every second. And that was what shocked everyone. Steve Harvey didn't just let a proposal happen on his stage. He turned it into one of the most unforgettable, hilarious, and heartwarming moments in television history. Steve Harvey grabbed the microphone with that trademark grin on his face, his mustache twitching like he was about to unleash something legendary. He looked at the audience, then at the couple, and finally shouted into the mic, Wait a minute, y'all. If we gonna do this, we gonna do it right. The audience erupted with anticipation, cheering like they already knew Steve was about to turn this moment into pure gold. He snapped his fingers with flair. Instantly, the stage lights dimmed to a soft glow, casting the couple in a spotlight. Romantic music, sweet, soulful, and dramatic, started to play through the speakers. The crowd gasped in delight, clapping and hollering as if they were suddenly at a live concert. But Steve wasn't finished. Behind him, the giant screen lit up with a glowing heart animation, sparkling in bright red and gold. The producers, sensing this was a once-in-a-lifetime moment, had jumped in to make the scene even more magical. Steve strutted across the stage like a master conductor, directing the energy in the room. He walked right up to the couple, handed them both the microphone, and said in that booming voice of his, Now kiss her like you mean it before I change my mind and kick y'all off my stage. The audience roared with laughter. The young man and woman looked at each other, eyes wide, hearts racing, and then they went for it. A kiss so passionate and so genuine that the entire crowd jumped to their feet, clapping, cheering, and screaming at the top of their lungs. And then, just when everyone thought it couldn't get any bigger, boom! From the sides of the stage, confetti cannons exploded, showering the couple and half the audience in a storm of colorful paper. Red, white, and gold pieces floated through the air like a celebration straight out of a movie. It wasn't even planned. Steve's crew had improvised it on the spot, knowing this moment deserved to go down in TV history. People in the crowd were recording on their phones, tears streaming down their faces, as strangers hugged each other and jumped around like they had just witnessed the greatest live show of their lives. Steve stepped back, folded his arms, and watched with mock seriousness, his lips pursed like a proud father watching kids graduate. Then, with that comedic timing only he has, he turned back to the audience and delivered the punchline. See? Y'all thought you was just gonna watch my show today. But now you had a whole engagement party. That's why you never know what's gonna happen when Steve Harvey's in the building. The audience screamed in agreement, stomping their feet and chanting his name. The camera zoomed out, capturing the couple kissing under falling confetti. The crowd waving and cheering, and Steve Harvey standing in the middle of it all like the king of unpredictable television. The clip didn't just stay in that studio. Overnight, it exploded across the internet. People clipped it, shared it, and replayed it on every social media platform imaginable. Within hours, it had millions of views. The hashtags cornered Steve Harvey proposal and best TV moment ever were trending worldwide. Comment sections filled with people saying things like, "This is why I love Steve Harvey. He turns everything into a celebration." Others wrote, "That couple is so lucky. Imagine getting engaged with Steve Harvey as your hype man." Even celebrities reposted the moment, adding their reactions, calling it one of the most joyful and hilarious proposals they had ever seen on television. And to this day, fans still talk about it. They don't just remember the proposal, they remember the way Steve Harvey transformed an ordinary surprise into an unforgettable, larger-than-life event. A moment so genuine, so hilarious, and so full of love that it became one of the most talked-about clips in daytime TV history. Because only Steve Harvey could take a simple yes and turn it into a once-in-a-lifetime celebration. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful and inspiring stories. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.